Hey class, in today's lesson I'm going to be going over tasks 11 through 15 just like how you saw in the title of the video. Remember, when I go over these tasks, these procedures, I'm not only defining them for you, I'm telling you how they would be implemented in ABA. Of course, for my independent learners, the study guide's going to be shown right after this clip. So if you don't have time to watch the whole hour lesson, you're going to have the study guide provided for you. But I strongly suggest, if you can, continue watching the lesson. We're going to start now with stimulus control transfer. I wonder if, as I read that, I wonder if it's always called stimulus control transfer, because the way I've always said it is stimulus transfer control. I may have always said it wrong. So, stimulus control transfer, let me see here, is the way I would have rather them said this. I mean, some things, when you read this, it can be kind of scary. Sometimes when we read some of these words, it can be kind of, not scary, but intimidating, because the terms they use are so technical, but you realize that the terms are very technical because applied behavioral analysis is a science, and it's not just any science, it's an evidence-based science. So it's a real science. So, and that's why they use words like stimulus, that's why they use words like differential reinforcement, that's why they use words like preference assessment, continuous measurement. So that's why they use like those super technical terms, only because it's a real science. And so when you're being tested on a real science, you have to know the technical terms for things, because every other science, biology, I don't know, biology, medicine, whatever, they all have terms that are very technical. So, and you have to know them, even though they can be explained in a more simple way. And you might think like after I explain to you right now what stimulus control transfer is, you're gonna be like, well, why do they say it like that? Like, and I don't, and it's because it's a science and they want to sound, they want it to sound really like professional. So stimulus control transfer, I would have much rather, like if I were writing this, especially for an RBT level, I would have just written it as prompt transferring. That's probably how I would have written it, because that's essentially what you're doing. So, or prompt fading. That's basically what it is. So, stimulus control transfer. It's when you, how would I write it? So, it's basically when the learner responds to one stimulus and then through time learns how to respond to another stimulus. I'll write it down for you. When a learner responds to one stimulus and then learns to respond to another. This is a very simplified way of explaining it. It may be oversimplified, but I would say this is acceptable for a new RBT taking their competency exam. This is I would say it's a good way to explain it. And I'll give you an example. This is a very popular example. when when you have a learner who doesn't know how to tie their shoes or doesn't really have the awareness that they need to tie their shoes, and then the stimulus you're gonna give them most likely is tie your shoes, right? And that's the stimulus, that's your SD, tie your shoes. And throughout time, you want that child to learn just to automatically tie their shoes without you having to tell them, right? That's when a learner learns, right? When a child learns how to tie their shoes without you having to tell them, then they've learned that when their shoelaces are untied, they have to tie them. So they learned. So you're gonna start by telling them, tie your shoes, and then you're gonna start to fade the verbal cue out, the verbal prompt out, and you might go to a gestural prompt, and we're not at prompting yet, it's coming up next. You might go to a gestural prompt where you point to their shoelaces, and then they know without you saying tie your shoes, you point to their shoelaces and they tie their shoes. So that is an example of stimulus controlled transfer. You've transferred the verbal prompt to the gestural prompt, and the learner has responded to the new prompt of you pointing to their shoes. That would be stimulus control transfer. So how would I write it? I'd probably just put tying. Oh, I'm not gonna do it like that. Okay. Shoe tying. I don't even think that's the right. I have to look it up. Yeah, it's like that, shoe tying. Okay, shoe tying. All right, so we're gonna think about shoe tying. You're gonna start with a verbal prompt. Tie. I'm gonna color code this for you too. Tie your shoes. And then the control would be, the control transfer is learner through time responds to a gestural prompt. Rbt points to untied shoe laces. And that's it, right? That's what it is. It's the word, right? The term sounds like, what the heck is that? But it's really not. It's not that hard. Shoe tying. And now just do a little thing here, and then one little thing here. What would I do here? I'd probably I'd like to underline this. What would be a complementary color? Probably green, or, well, purple would be a complementary color. But I really kind of just, this is really important, so I'll just put this in a box. And then this is what it is. Control transfer is learner through time responds to a gestural prompt. Okay? Not too hard. And let me go up here and also highlight this for you. Although I suppose at this point it doesn't matter because I'm going to show you, or you're going to have this written down. This is going to all be typed. You've probably already seen that typed if you're at this point. Okay, so next is prompting. Here we go. So we've got prompting. You're gonna prompt a lot as an RBT. I mean, that prompting is the way people learn, not just children with autism. I mean, that's how you teach, is through prompting. So there are different types of prompts, right? There are verbal prompts, which is pretty self-explanatory, but it's when you say to do something. And then there are gestural. I'll just write the whole thing. There are gestural prompts. There is partial physical. There's full physical. And there's also positional prompts. And there might be more, but these are the ones that you would use the most. So there is a prompt hierarchy. I feel like, obviously, full, and when I say hierarchy, I mean what would be the most invasive prompt to the least invasive prompt. And if you're studying for your RBT examination, you need to know most to least, the difference between most to least prompting and least to most prompting. And when you're working as an RBT, your BCBA may tell you, oh, I want you to use most to least prompting. Or they might tell you, I want you to use least to most prompting. So most to least would start with, obviously, a full physical. So a full physical would be, for example, if a child is learning how to write their name, but they don't really know how to form letters, you're going to go hand over hand, and you're going to write their name with your hand over this. So they're going to be holding the pencil. You're going to put your hand over their hand, and you're going to write their name with them, right? They may not even try and form the letter, but they're holding the pencil, and you're doing the movements with them hand over hand. And then you're going to start to fade that out once you realize they're taking a little bit more control. And then you're going to go to partial. And then you may just have your hand on their knuckles. And then you might only put a little bit of pressure while they're writing their name, right? So you're fading out that prompt. And then so that would be full, physical, partial, right? Positional prompts are for when perhaps you're doing a program where they have to show you something, right? So let's say you have an array of 3 pictures, and you tell them, point to the dog, and they can't find the dog. So you would probably, more than likely, you're gonna, just so that you can get a correct response out of them, you're gonna push that picture of the dog a little bit closer to them, so that when you say it, you're gonna give your SD again. You're gonna say point to the dog, and then since it's closer to them, they're gonna point to the thing that's closest to them. And then gestural prompts, it's just when you're pointing to something. So you're just gonna point. I would say that gestural prompts are the easiest prompts to fade out than any one of, and I'll highlight this. Gestural prompts are the easiest types of prompts to fade out. It's much easier for a learner to become independent from prompts when you use gestural prompts than verbal prompts. So let's say that your child simply, or your learner, has to turn pages in a book, right? You're reading with them, whatever, and the goal is for them to turn the page. Rather than you saying, turn the page, it's better for you to point to the page so that they can turn it. Now, if they're not there yet, you're gonna have to give them this prompt, right? You're gonna have to do a little bit more of an invasive prompt. You're gonna have to tell them. But it's, these are harder to fade out, right? Full physical, depending on the learner, that's pretty hard to fade out. Partial, I wouldn't say is too hard. Well, the physical prompts I would say are pretty hard to fade out, because some kids with autism, they become very prompt dependent on physical prompts. But sometimes, and a lot of times, you need to do these, because otherwise, if you're not doing physical prompts, they're not going to learn it. They're not going to learn whatever you're teaching them. So we do physical prompts because it's necessary. But we don't always want to, so we don't want our learners in ABA therapy forever, and so we don't always want them to be prompt dependent. And so, we never want them to be prompt dependent, right? We use prompts so that they can learn, and if they're prompt dependent, that means that they're not learning, and the only way that they can do something is because you're prompting them. So once you realize, oh, this child is prompt dependent, definitely talk to your supervisor, your BCPA, the analyst on the case, and tell them, hey, this kid is prompt dependent. He's not doing this any other way. And they're gonna help you, and there has to be an intervention that takes place where you start fading the prompts. That's very important. So prompting you're gonna do every single day, more than likely, with your child, depending on where they are on the spectrum. And these aren't bad. Physical prompts aren't bad. They're necessary. But the goal is to eventually fade out these prompts so that the learner can do whatever you want them to do, whatever you're trying to teach them to do, independently. That's the goal, right? We want our learners to be independent. So these would be some sort of prompts. There's also a prompt I didn't put here. There's also modeling, which is I guess it's a type of prompt. Modeling is when, for example, I had to teach one of my learners how to trace, and he had different supervisors on his case, and they told me, like, he knows how to trace, and I would look at him tracing, and he was just not doing it in an like, I wouldn't accept the way he would do it, and I would have to go in and help him, and they would tell me, like, he knows how to do it, he's just not doing it. Like, and to me, I would say perhaps he does know how to do it, but he hasn't mastered it, right? And so what I would do is provide a model for him. So he had to trace his name, and then I printed out a sheet, and he had the same sheet. So I got a sheet and I traced his name, and then I showed it to him, and I told him, this is what I want it to look like. And so that's a prompt. That's a model prompt, right? Or I suppose modeling could also be like that. I would say that that's like a form of, that could also be, maybe not modeling, that might be like a visual prompt. Modeling could be, maybe, yeah, modeling is more of, I do it and then you copy me. I'm gonna model this for you, do it like this, and then they copy you. But of course, I suppose you could see how a visual prompt, like me giving you, like for that example, I just gave you an example of what I want you to do, of how I want you to trace your name. That piece of paper where I traced his name, that in a sense is a model, right, that I want you to copy. But don't get confused with modeling. I don't want to confuse you. Don't get confused with modeling and visual prompts, right? Because what I actually gave him was a visual prompt, not a model. Modeling is more of, I'm going to model this for you, I'm going to do it for you, and then you do it. So that's what modeling is. Forget what I said before. The prompt that I gave him when I traced his name and then I gave it to him, that's a visual prompt. Modeling is, I'm going to do it and then you're going to copy me. That's modeling. Don't get confused, right? I said it wrong. What I gave him was a visual prompt. But it's easy to get confused with a model and a visual prompt because, like I was saying before, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but you know, when you're giving them a visual prompt can be a type of model that you want them to copy. So that's where the confusion can lie, and that's kind of where I got confused for a brief moment as I'm explaining this to you. What I gave him was a visual prompt. Modeling is, I'll do it here. You do, and then they do. Okay? Okay, so that's prompting. Now we have token system. I feel like this form really changed. It used to be called token. This did change, okay? This used to be called token economy, not token systems. I'm pretty sure that's what when I did my competency assessment, it was called, you know, it was called token economies, but whatever. So token systems. They might ask you, when whoever's conducting this, they're probably not going to say token systems. They're going to say token economies or a token economy. Because this is really new. It's the same thing. Okay. So, token economy. A token economy is like a paycheck. So, they're usually going to have, right, you want to think about token boards. And what the learner is working for. So a token board is, and it can be it doesn't have to be a literal board. Some of them, some BCBAs make them really cute so that make really cute token boards so that their learner is more motivated to complete the token board. Usually a token board isn't gonna have more than like 5 spots to put a token. So I'll give you an example. Let's say this is a token board, right? And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it would probably say something like this: I am working for, and then it might have right here like a picture of something. So this helps the learner stay motivated to continue working and learning. So they might be, and it's going to be a picture. I mean, it might, more than likely it's going to be a picture. I am working for, and let's say Legos, right? Legos. And for every desirable behavior that the learner demonstrates, for every desirable behavior that your learner demonstrates, you're gonna give them a token, right? And so they have to get 5 tokens to get the Legos. Does that mean that between token 1 and token 2, you're not gonna reinforce them for the desirable behavior? No. It just means you're not reinforcing them with the Legos, because for them to get Legos, they need to get all 5 tokens. And a token is usually gonna be, if this is printed out, you could always do it like this on the iPad, right? And whatever. But usually, like, it's probably, your BCBA is probably gonna print it out for you. They might create it, or if you're working on fieldwork hours, you would likely create it for them yourself. And they have really cute ones. They've got like Minecraft ones and Spider-Man ones, Marvel ones, gamer ones, whatever. And then the token is gonna be like a square, like a small square like this, how I put. They put it on maybe like a form like Canva, whatever, a Word document. They put the picture of something. It might be, a token might be a picture of a coin, or it might be a picture of, if they're a gamer, maybe it's a picture of a remote control or something. And then for every desirable behavior that they do, you give them, it's gonna be laminated and it's gonna have Velcro, and then you're gonna put it on the token board. So it might be a physical thing, or it might be just something like this that you draw and they're looking at it, and then you're just gonna give them the X for every single time they give you, maybe not every single time, right? Because that's not here, schedules of reinforcement. But there is something called schedules of reinforcement. I think that's what it's called. And you're gonna need to know that for your exam. So there's FR1, 2, 3. Usually, I mean, there's different schedules of reinforcement. This is really the only one, FR, fixed ratio. This is the only one in the 2 years that I worked that I ever used was a fixed ratio. So that means, and your behavior analyst is gonna tell you. So if they're on a schedule that is, you're gonna reinforce them for every single time they do a desirable behavior, that's an FR1, right? So for every one behavior, one desirable behavior that they demonstrate, you're gonna give them a token. Then it could be, they might tell you for every 2 behaviors, for every 2 desirable behaviors that they demonstrate, then you're gonna give them the token. So you're not going to give them the token for the first desirable behavior they give you. You're going to wait for them to do another one, and then they get the 1 token. And then sometimes it might go up to 3. For every 3 desirable behaviors that they give you, then they get 1 token. There's also a variable, I think it's called variable ratio, where because the kids, these kids are smart. They're gonna catch on. They're gonna realize, oh, every 2 times I do something good, they're gonna give me a token. Every 3 times I do something good, they're gonna give me a token. So then they're gonna do it on purpose, and they're gonna go through this very quickly. So then what they might do is called I think it's called a variable ratio, or it's not a variable ratio. It's gonna be a variable schedule, right? And it could have been a variable ratio. I don't know. You might be working from a variable schedule, which means for every 1 to 2 behaviors, right? So for variable, because there's one that's fixed, and then there's variable that's fixed, and then there's variable that works on time. So it depends. So for variable schedules, it's for every 1 to 2 behaviors. It could be for every 2 to 3 behaviors. It's going to be an average. So you might give them the token between every 2 or 3. Or they might tell you between 2 and 4 behaviors. Then you can give them the token, so that they don't really know when they're going to get the token. At this, I would say, depending on your learner, right? So if your learner is, if your learner can catch on that they're getting one for every single fixed one, if they start to catch on, then your behavioral analyst might shift to this. Or if the behavioral analyst already understands that they're going to catch on very quickly to a fixed ratio, they may immediately tell you you're going to do it with in a variable way. So it's going to be an average between every 1 to 2 behaviors. You're going to give them the token. For every 2 to 3 behaviors, you're going to give them the token. It depends. They're going to tell you what the schedule is going to be like. So remember that when they're asking about token systems, you might want to include in there something called schedules of reinforcement, because it's different for everyone. And it's always going to be one of these. There's different ones. There's different types of schedules of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement can get really complicated. It's either going to be fixed or it's going to be variable, and it's going to be fixed in this way or it's going to be variable in that way. There's really no other way that they're going to do it. That's pretty much it, okay? Don't worry about all the other, you may have learned in your 40-hour training of the 500 million ways of schedules of reinforcement. I wouldn't worry about that. I've worked with so many I worked in 2 different agencies, and in the second agency I worked with like 5 different analysts, and they all used either this one or the other one. They never used any other kind of schedule of reinforcement. So just want to let you know that. So just to sum up, because I know that was kind of a little bit long, a token system is the same thing as a token economy. If they ask you what it is, you can say it's like a paycheck. For every desirable behavior, you're going to reward them with a token, and there might be, depending on the schedule of reinforcement. So that's what you would say. Token economies work on the way that would be implemented. If they were to ask you, how do you implement a token economy? How do you implement a token system? You're going to say through token boards, and you need to ask, well, you would ideally ask, what do you want to work for? You're going to ask the learner what they want to work for. You're not going to tell them you're going to work for this. You're going to ask the learner, what do you want to work for? Because that's what's going to motivate them to work. So I hope that is a good conclusion. I'll say it again. Token systems, same thing as token economy. They're implemented through token boards. You're going to ask what the learner wants to work for, and there are different, you're going to reinforce them with a token depending on the schedule of reinforcement. For crisis and emergency, when you're gonna get tested on that, and I'm not gonna write anything down here. I don't need to write anything down for this. They're simply gonna ask you what you would do in a crisis or emergency. The most common thing, I mean, it's not very common, but what they might ask you, and they're gonna give you an example, like what would you do if your learner had an allergic reaction? That might be the most common question they would ask, because it's typical among children with autism that they have a lot of allergies. So they might ask you, what would you do? And if it were me, I'd say, well, what kind of allergic reaction? And because if it's anaphylaxis, then you would need to, if they have an EpiPen, use their EpiPen, and if they don't, either way, you need to call 911. So if they have an EpiPen, you use the EpiPen, you call 911, and as you're doing all that, make whoever's there, whoever's with you, because there's always going to be someone there. It's either going to be the parent if you're in the home, or the caretaker. Somebody's going to be in the home with you. An adult is going to be there with you. Either their mom, dad, caretaker, they're going to be there. So you need to let them know, and then call 911. And then if you're in a center, you're going to let people know, and you're going to let them know. You could do the EpiPen, they'll call 911. Even if you use an EpiPen, you still need to call 911. I don't know really what else they would ask you for that question. I don't know. That would be the most common question they would ask. What other kind of emergency? Okay, what if, because we're talking about a crisis or an emergency. So if the child, okay, here's another good one. What if the learner swallows like a small piece of plastic? What if they swallow something they shouldn't have? Well, I mean, they're not choking, right? Let's just say they swallow something. You would have to tell the parent they just swallowed this, and the parent needs to determine what they're going to do about it. And then if you're working in a center, you would need to tell your behavioral analyst or your team leader, or because if your analyst is not there, they may not be there, you would tell your team leader. If the clinical director is there, you would tell the clinical director. If there's a team leader, tell a team leader. They're going to know what to do. They're more than likely going to contact the director or the behavioral analyst, whoever's there, and let them know, hey, this child swallowed this. And then the analyst would be responsible for letting the parent know, or they should be the ones responsible for letting the parent know what happened. And you need to tell them exactly what happened and why did they swallow, what they shouldn't have swallowed, what happened. You need to tell them. And if you can't tell them what happened, that's really not good. So if that does happen, because kids, even neurotypical kids, put things in their mouth all the time, make sure you're always watching the child. Make sure your eyes are always on your learner, and that you always know what happened, because the parent may not be around. You might be working in a center. They may have swallowed something. If they swallowed something they weren't supposed to, the parent is going to want to know why. And if you can't tell your behavioral analyst what happened, that's not good. So make sure your eyes are always on your learner. If they're choking, what are you going to do? CPR. As an RBT, I'm pretty sure every single, I'm CPR certified. I'm pretty sure every RBT is CPR certified. At least I was required to get CPR certified. So if they're choking, they might ask you, what would you do if your learner is choking, right? You're not going to do CPR until there's no pulse, right? So you're not going to immediately say, oh, I'm going to do CPR. You do CPR when you can't feel for a pulse. you're gonna either do, depending on how old the learner is, you're gonna do a Heimlich maneuver. If they're really young, you're gonna probably, if you can see the item that they're choking on, you're gonna try and take it out, you know. So things like that. Those are things that they're gonna ask you for crisis and emergency situations, things like that. For task 15, it says that you have to demonstrate antecedent, right? You're either going to demonstrate an antecedent intervention, a form of differential reinforcement, or extinction. Now, I can't imagine a supervisor asking you to demonstrate an antecedent manipulation. I mean, I learned it as antecedent manipulation, but okay, I can't imagine them asking you to demonstrate an antecedent intervention. I suppose they could, but that would be kind of a little bit involved, I think. I think more so they'd ask you more of like, what is an antecedent intervention, and can you give me an example? And then the same thing with extinction. 100%, they're not going to ask you to demonstrate extinction with the client. 100%. They're not going to ask you to do that. Extinction is I'm not there yet, but extinction is a punishment procedure, and they're not going to ask you to do that with a client. That would be ridiculous. No supervisor is going to ask you to do that with a client. The only one that makes sense that you would do with a client, if they want you to do one of these with a client, would be differential reinforcement. Remember, you just have to do one of them. But when I was tested on this for the first time, I had to demonstrate all three. And when I say demonstrate, I had to know all three of them. Like, I was asked about all of them the first time I did this exam. The second time I did the exam, I was only asked about one of them. But the first time I did the exam, my supervisor asked me to do all three. Or to explain all three. Okay, so here we go. We're gonna start now with antecedent interventions. All right. I'm going to tell you what your supervisor wants to hear when they ask you what is an antecedent intervention. And then I'm going to tell you how it's more than what they want to hear. But first, let me write down what they want you to say. The supervisor is going to want you to say that an antecedent intervention is a preventative measure taken to limit or reduce maladaptive behavior, and I'll just do BX. Okay, that's what they want to hear. But I want you to be a great RBT, and I want you to know that everything you do in your therapy session is an antecedent intervention, right? Everything. So, and let me explain the definition a little bit further. So, a preventative measure taken to limit or reduce maladaptive behavior. So, what do I mean by preventative measure? What does that mean? Let's say, and we have to focus here. So, these would be the operative words: preventative measure and maladaptive behavior. Those are the operative words. And I'm going to give you an example. Let's say one of your client's behavior this is a very popular example, is hair pulling. So what are you going to do to limit or reduce hair pulling? If you have long hair, you're going to put your hair in a braid. Some people just say put your hair up. I say put your hair in a braid, because even if your hair is up, they could still yank like those strands and that's gonna hurt. But if they yank the braid, that's not, I don't think it would hurt as much. So for example, it would be hair pulling, and then what you would do is, I'll do it this way, put hair up like in a braid. That's a super common example. They're probably gonna ask you for a different example because they probably hear that all the time. So another example, let's think here. Let's say one of your clients, one of your learners, or let's say your learner, his behavior is that he scratches, right? That's one of, he has aggression, he's an aggressive learner, and one of the ways, we would call that typography, which is what the behavior looks like. What does the aggression look like? And one way the aggression looks like is that he scratches people. So what would you do to prevent that behavior? Now, this probably wouldn't completely prevent it, but it might, right? So let's see. In theory, it might. So for example, we're gonna say scratching. What would you do to limit it? You're gonna cut your client's nails. Or I'm sorry, learner. Cut learner's nails. Now, if you're working in a center, you're gonna have more liberty to cut your learner's nails. Centers are more than likely going to have the clippers that are safe for children, and you can go ahead and do it. If you don't know how to cut nails, and if you've never cut a child's nails before, don't do it, because you may not do it correctly. You may cut them too short. Maybe even if their nails aren't bleeding, they still can be too short, and it's gonna cause them some discomfort if your nails are too short, even if they're not bleeding. If you're in the home and the parents are there and your learner is scratching you and they have long nails, and that's why they keep doing it, because if they have long nails, they're gonna get a reaction out of you, right? I mean, it's just normal. You have to train yourself not to react, but ideally, I mean, they can scratch you to the point where you're bleeding, and even if you don't react and they see blood, they know they got you, right? So if you're in the home and they're scratching you and you're bleeding, which is often the case, or they leave a mark, you don't even have to bleed. They could just leave a mark, and if they see that they left a mark, they know they got you, whether or not you react. So if that happens, you wouldn't obviously cut their nails because you're in the home. You can't just go ahead and do that because their parent is there and they're gonna be like, what are you doing? What you can do is discreetly tell your behavioral analyst, the analyst on the case, hey, this learner engages in a lot of scratching. He's leaving marks on me, and can you please tell the parent to cut their nails? And your analyst is responsible for doing that. You're not responsible for telling the parent that they need to cut their child's nails. The analyst is responsible for telling the parent, you need to cut the child's nails. And they wouldn't even say, because they're hurting my RBT, they're gonna say, and this is true, because every learner, every child, right? Every child, whether they're neurotypical or they have autism, you need to cut their nails. Why? Because it's not only they can hurt you. You always need to keep in mind as an RBT the safety of that child. And if their nails are too long, they can scratch themselves. Kids, they rub their eyes a lot. They rub their face a lot. If their nails are too long, they can scratch their eye, and that's going to be really painful. Or they can scratch their maybe they're itchy and they scratch themselves and then they start bleeding because their nail is too long. So it's really it's for the safety of the child, and then yeah, also for everyone the child interacts with. So this would be a preventative measure to reduce maladaptive behavior. How is cutting learners' nails preventative toward scratching? Well, because they might still attempt to scratch. They still have fingers, right? But if they're scratching and they're not leaving any marks and you're not bleeding, they're likely not going to keep doing it because they see like nothing is happening. So that's how it's still an antecedent intervention. Okay, so now you have some examples. So now I can backtrack, or now I can move forward. I kind of mentioned this before. Now I can tell you what I really want you to know about antecedent interventions so that you can be a really good RBT. And what I want you to understand is that taking a preventative measure to limit maladaptive behavior is simply manipulating the environment. And that's what you do for your entire therapy session, and that's what you do with that's part of ABA. That's such a big part of ABA. You need to manipulate the environment so that you can get the responses that you want from your learner. So literally what I think is, I would say like 80% of what you do in applied behavioral analysis as an RBT is an antecedent intervention. You need to manipulate the environment so that you can get the desired responses from your learner. It's not only to limit or reduce maladaptive behavior. You can use antecedent interventions to get desirable behaviors, to increase desirable behaviors. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you're working in a center and you have a learner who doesn't like to socialize, really likes to play alone, and they have a favorite, their favorite toy is Legos. Okay, and they don't like to socialize, and they don't like going into the activity room when it's time to play together with their peers. Okay, so what are you gonna do? What I would do is, I'm not gonna offer you Legos until it's time to go into the activity room to play with your peers. So I'm manipulating when he gets access or she gets access to those Legos. They're only gonna have access to the Legos when it's time to go into the activity room. Doing that means that, okay, now you have the Legos, and they're like, I want Legos, and I'll be like, okay, it's activity room time, you can have the Legos. So what are they gonna, now they're in the activity room among their peers, and they're engaging in the same behavior that their peers are engaging in, which is, let's say it's time to play and do NET. Now they're in the room, which they were probably not doing before. Now they're in the room, they're playing with their favorite toy, and you're gonna give them their favorite toy because they're in the room that they didn't want to be in before, and they're among their peers. Does it matter if they're engaging with their peers and they're only playing with the Legos by themselves? At that point, I would say no, because at that point, you really just want them to be in the room. And now you're making the room fun for them because they get Legos when they're in the room. So do you see how it's not just limited, you're not just using an antecedent intervention to limit maladaptive behavior? But what they want to hear is this. This is what they want to hear. A preventative measure taken to limit or reduce maladaptive behavior. But I did want to teach you that so that you can be a really great RBT. I'll say it in short. You can use antecedent interventions to increase desirable behaviors. Meaning, you can manipulate the environment to increase desirable behaviors. Okay. Differential reinforcement. There are many kinds, but you just need to know 3. What is this? What's going on here? Okay. Yeah, different kinds, you just need to know 3. I'm just gonna write DRA here. and I'm just gonna write alternative. DR stands for differential reinforcement. So DRA is differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. DRA is when you reinforce a learner for engaging in a desirable behavior when they normally don't. So I'm going to make this more specific because this is very broad. So what I mean by when you reinforce a learner for engaging in a desirable behavior when they normally don't, I'm saying if your learner, if they want something and they don't ask for it politely, and what they do is demand for it, like, I'll use the Legos again, like, give me Legos, I get my Legos now, you're not going to reinforce that. You're going to correct them, you know, you're going to say, you need to ask for it nicely. How do you ask for that nicely? Right? You can say, how do you ask for it nicely? Depending on if you know they can demonstrate that behavior. If not, you're going to teach them how to ask for it nicely. And then when they do ask for it nicely or politely, then you're going to reinforce them. So DRA would be when the normal thing that the learner does is make demands to receive things. You're going to reinforce them when they ask for things politely. That's DRA. So you're not reinforcing them when they make demands. You're reinforcing them when they request things politely. That would be DRA. That is the alternative. The alternative is them asking politely. That's what you're reinforcing. So I'll put here normal would be, or put normal behavior or typical behavior. I don't want to write normal because that word has so many connotations to it. So we'll write here typical behavior. It's rude. And then alternative when learner is polite. And so this is what you're going to reinforce right here. This is what you're reinforcing, the alternative, right? Okay, let's go to DRO. DRO is differential reinforcement of other behavior. DRO is, you probably haven't learned, I don't know, maybe you did in your 40-hour training. And I'm giving you extra information because, like I said before, I want you to be a good RBT, so I want you to know these things. And you can talk about, you can discuss these things during your assessment, during your interview, when you're trying to get a job or whatever. It will make you sound a little bit more distinguished if you know a little bit more about these things. So DRO is sometimes confused with, or it's likened often to non-contingent reinforcement. But there is a difference. I don't know if you learned about non-contingent reinforcement in your 40-hour training. If you didn't, it's okay. I'll tell you a very simplified. It is very simple in general. It sounds like what it is. So it's you know, it is what it sounds like. But let's stick to DRO right here. So this is when you reinforce your learner after an allocated time of them engaging in desirable behavior. So, for example, let's say something your learner does is, one of their behaviors is self-stimulatory behaviors. And just so you know, not all children with autism engage in self-stimulatory behaviors, but I would say probably a lot do. Okay, so let's say one of the self-stimulatory behaviors is that your learner really likes to tap on things a lot, or they just like to tap their leg, and they're always tapping their leg non-stop. And then your supervisor says, okay, we're gonna put them on a DRO. You're gonna reinforce them when they're not tapping on their leg for 3 minutes. So that means that for those 3 minutes that they're not tapping on their leg, you have to wait those 3 minutes, and you have to make sure that in those 3 minutes they're doing this. They're doing a desirable behavior, right? So they have to be doing a desirable behavior for an allocated time. And that allocated time is determined by your supervisor. They're gonna let you know. Honestly, you're probably not even gonna use this, but you have to know it. So let's say for the 3 minutes they're not tapping on their for the 3 minutes that they're not tapping on their leg, they're being productive with blocks. They're engaging with blocks in an appropriate way. They're building with blocks. Or they're doing DTT with you and they didn't tap their leg while they were doing DTT for the 3 minutes. So then after those 3 minutes, you would reinforce them. I just want to say this really quickly. You're not going to reinforce them by saying how great it was that they didn't do what you didn't want them to do. You're simply going to reinforce them for doing the desirable behavior, right? This is how you're going to reinforce. You're going to reinforce by telling them how great they did the desirable behavior. So if they did blocks, they were playing appropriately with blocks for 3 minutes without tapping on their leg, you're going to say, oh my goodness, I love how that was such a tall building. How many blocks did you line up? Or, I mean, not line up, you don't want them to line them up, but like, what did you build? Oh my goodness, is this a house? Is it, a rocket ship? What is it? Tell me what it is. I can't figure it out. This looks so cool. It's so abstract. Whatever. And you're going to reinforce them for doing that. Because the more you reinforce them engaging in appropriate behaviors, the idea is that the tapping is going to go down. But you're going to do it, obviously, they would have to be doing it, they would have to be not engaging in the tapping for an allocated amount of time. I would imagine you would only do this, the DRO, if the behavior that they do is continuous. Like they're always engaging in it. So you never really have a chance to reinforce them for something else. And then you would put them, I think anyway, I don't know. I don't know, because I never used DRO. What RBTs mainly use is DRA. That's gonna be the most commonly way you're gonna reinforce your learner is through DRA. Now I'll tell you really quickly what non-contingent reinforcement is. Non-contingent, and it would be wonderful if you did. You need to do this as an RBT because it's very important. Non-contingent reinforcement is when you reinforce your learner just because, right? It's not because they did something you asked them to do. you're reinforcing your learner throughout session for small things they should be doing anyway, right? So you wanna, and I'm not saying reinforce them for everything, but it's just the reinforcement they're receiving is just not contingent, meaning it's not linked to something that you asked them to do or something that you told them to do or something that they have to do. It's basically like grace. I am reinforcing you because that was so cool. I didn't ask you to do that, nothing, whatever. That it's not even, what they did is not even part of, it's not written in their behavior support program, but they did it anyway, and you're gonna reinforce them for that. And you're gonna have a lot of opportunities to do that during session, and so definitely give the non-contingent reinforcement when you can. Because some kids can catch on where it's like, oh, I'm only being reinforced when I do something. And what if your mom or dad only ever told you nice things when you did something nice for them, and then they never told you anything nice? Like the only time you received a gift was if you got an A on a test, or if you did something, or if you cleaned up your room. That was the only time you ever got anything. Right? As a kid, sometimes you want your parents to give you things or to tell you things, nice things, just because they love you. And so that's basically what non-contingent reinforcement is. You don't need to know it for this competency exam, but I want you to know it because I want you to be a great RBT, and children need non-contingent reinforcement. Okay, so DRI, you might use this. I use this a little bit. This is incompatible. I use this a little bit. You're gonna use DRA and DRI more than DRO. I think that's how you spell it. Incompatible. Everything I spell, I'm just so insecure about my spelling. I'm actually looking income. And it's so funny because, like, yeah, that's how you spell it. It's so funny because the English language is phonetic, so it shouldn't be. I mean, it's mostly phonetic. There are some words that aren't, but so it shouldn't be hard to spell in English, but for me, I don't know, it is. Okay. Differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior is I can tell it's kind of hard to write down. So you're basically going to reinforce your learner for doing something while they can't do the maladaptive behavior. So let me see how I write it. When you reinforce your learner when they can't engage in their, I'll just put like this, behaviors, right? And when we say behaviors in the field of ABA, we just mean maladaptive behaviors. So usually that's how the word is used. When we say, oh, their behaviors, we're talking about those challenging behaviors, those maladaptive behaviors, usually. So what I mean by this, and the only way I can really explain this better is by giving you an example. So if your learner likes to move around a lot, and the way that they like to move around a lot is by running back and forth. Let's say you're working in a center or even in the home, and the way they like to do it is by running around all over the place because they have that motor self-stimulation, right? Self-stimulatory behavior. It's motor SSB. So they just like to, and the way that's the typography of that is constantly running here, running there. Well, ideally you need that behavior to reduce because they can hit themselves, hurt themselves, whatever, bump into something, and they can also hurt you. So obviously that behavior needs to decrease. Now, what can you do to reinforce them while they can't possibly be running? And so what would you do? What would you do? So if they have motor SSB, right? And let's say that the behavior is running and they're constantly running around, what is something they can do that is desirable, but they can't run while they do it? And what I would say is probably give them a jump ball. So by a jump ball, I don't know what the actual ball is called, but a jump ball is that ball that has a handle on it. It looks like a yoga ball almost, maybe a little bit smaller, and it's got a handle on it, and they sit on it and they're jumping. So it's kind of an alternative, but more specifically, it's DRI. You're gonna reinforce them for jumping on the ball rather than running around. They can't, and this is why it's called incompatible. They can't jump on that ball and run at the same time. So you're gonna reinforce them for jumping on the ball. And that would be a DRI. It's DRI because they can't run and jump on the ball at the same time. It kind of seems like DRA because it's still technically an alternative, like this is an alternative to them running. But you have to think about it a little bit further and understand that even though it looks like a DRA, it's incompatible. They can't do it at the same time. So it's a little bit more specific. And you have to, when you're taking your RBT exam, they're gonna give you, this is just for the competency exam, but when you take your written test, you need to know that. You need to know they're gonna give you scenarios and they're gonna ask you what form of reinforcement this is. And you might get confused with alternative and incompatible if you don't realize, if you don't look at the reinforcement a little bit deeper. You can't do this at the same time, right? So if they're reinforcing them for something they can't do at the same time, that is DRI. Pretty simple. All right, last thing. Extinction. And this is a really easy thing. So let me do this here so it's like separate. Extinction. Extinction is when it's super easy to know. When you don't reinforce a behavior that was previously reinforced. That would be extinction. So what do I mean by that? Let's say every time a child whines, their parent reinforces them. Let's say a child whines because they want something. And every time that child whines to get something, their parent gives them that thing. So that's a maladaptive behavior that's being reinforced. They're reinforcing them asking for what they want in an inappropriate way. Now, because they already know how to do that and they know that that's how they get what they want, when you come in and they want something, they're gonna whine for it. And what you're gonna do is not reinforce that. You're not even gonna give it attention, I would say. You're not gonna give it attention. Maybe the first time they do it, you can say you need to ask nicely if you know that they can demonstrate that behavior. If they can't demonstrate that behavior, you need to teach them how to demonstrate how to ask nicely. But if they do know how to ask nicely, and they don't, maybe the first 1 or 2 times you can tell them to ask nicely, and then and then you would probably just ignore it after that, right? I mean, I don't know. Normally you would ignore behaviors if they're maintained by attention. That would be if they're whining because they want something. I'll let you think here for a second. What is that? What would be the function of that behavior? It's tangible, right? The whining is maintained by tangibles, right? It's something that they get. So I think the first thing I would do is teach them how to do it, how to ask for it nicely. And if they just continue to if they just don't do it when you know that they can, then I would just ignore them and move on. That's what I would do. But always ask your analyst. Now, your analyst, to conclude here, your analyst may ask you what may happen when you implement extinction. And you're going to say an extinction burst. An extinction burst is exactly what it sounds like. It's when the behavior, the maladaptive behavior, bursts. So it gets even worse, right? So extinction burst, I'm going to keep writing it in red. When the maladaptive behavior gets worse. And this usually happens the first time you're implementing the procedure. Okay? This happens the first time you implement the procedure usually. And it may continue to happen, but basically what you need to know about this is that if you want to tell your supervisor in a very simple way, you can just say, it gets worse before it gets better. And there you have it. That is tasks 6 through 15. I know this part, I know task 15, I spent a lot of time on it, but I did want to give you some extra things to make you a more distinguished RBT that would hopefully help you in your, what are those things called? When you're getting hired, I can't remember the name right now. in what, you know, when you're applying for jobs and for job interviews, that's the word. I hope that the extra information I shared with you helps you in your job interviews. I hope that it helps you also in your competency assessment and also in your RBT exam. Next video would be the last one. We're gonna do tasks 16 through 20. Hi learners, thank you so much for being part of this class. If you have any questions or don't understand anything I went over, you can always leave a comment down below and I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Tasks 16 through 20 is already uploaded. Task 16 is a lesson in isolation. I focus a lot on how to write a SOAP note, and then tasks 17 through 20, that lesson is also already posted. So you can go ahead and continue studying if you feel motivated to do so. Don't forget to like and subscribe.